your autofocus is probably failing you more than you think. So you frame up your shot, the light is hitting your subject perfectly, you click and, well, it's blurry. That's not just frustrating. Failures like this often make you question if photography is even for you. But here's the thing. It's not your fault. Your camera's autofocus probably isn't broken, it just hasn't been set up properly. And so in this video, I'm going to walk you through how your autofocus actually works, which is crazier than you might think, and the settings to apply in your camera that are going to help you stop missing your shots. Because let's be honest, if you're anything like me, an amateur photographer with dreams of getting that epic shot of those skittish deer in the woods, then you're not going to get many chances at it, and so when the moment does come around, you don't want to blow it. And if you want to rapidly go from complete novice or stuck intermediate to a rock-solid landscape photographer in just 30 days without having to spend more money on expensive camera gear, I've got a 30-day landscape photography fundamentals training where I'm going to teach you everything that I've learned over 2 years of creating images that have been seen millions and millions of times. If you want a proven shortcut to create images that make your friends, family, and social media say, wow, then check out the link in the description below. Right, so let's stop guessing about your autofocus and I'll explain exactly how it works. And as soon as you know the mechanism that your camera uses to autofocus, then you can help it do a better job rather than constantly trying to fight against it. Think of your autofocus system like having a little assistant inside your camera. This assistant is connected to both a brain, which is the camera's processor, and then some very tiny little muscles. And this is the motor within your camera's lens. The assistant's job is to look at the scene that you're pointing your camera at and to say, hey, right, that bit there, that's the bit that we want sharp, and then shift the lens back and forth until the right part of your scene is focused on the camera sensor. Now, this is a pretty fundamental way of looking at things. You probably know that bit already, but there's actually two very different ways that this little assistant can help out. So here is the deal. When attempting to focus on your selected subject, your camera either looks at how sharp the image is using contrast detection, or it splits the image into two and tries to align them, and this is called phase detection. Both processes are doing exactly the same job. They are focusing the lens so you get a nice, sharp, crisp image, but they go about doing this job very differently. Contrast detection is like squinting at a blurry image, going, this isn't quite sharp enough, and then moving backwards or forwards a little, and then checking again, and then repeating this over and over, back and forth, until the image looks sharp. When using contrast autofocus, your camera checks pixel contrast, or how different the light values are between the edges of a subject, and then keeps adjusting the lens until the contrast hits its peak, and that's when it's going to be the most sharp. It's super accurate when it gets there, but it is slow. It has to hunt back and forth, and you've probably seen this if you've used this type of focus method in your camera, right? It goes back and forth until it gets the shot in focus. And in low light or a low contrast scene, like a foggy, misty woodland, for example, it just gets confused and just doesn't work very well. Now, phase detection autofocus skips all that hunting back and forth, and it's capable of locking onto your subject much quicker and much more accurately. And how it works is pretty much a technical marvel. So imagine your camera sensor as being a giant grid of little light collectors. In phase detection, some of these collectors are, well, they're special. They are split into two halves, and these halves look at the same image, but from slightly different angles. And when an image is out of focus, those two halves see different things. Inversely, when an image is in focus, those two halves see the image matched up perfectly. Now, some sensors use micro lenses to bend light slightly left or right so that each half of the detector sees a slightly different perspective. Some use partially masked pixels that can only see from one angle. Either way, it's all about collecting two views of the same thing and then finding the sweet spot as to where they overlap exactly. And on modern mirrorless cameras, this all happens right on the imaging sensor. That means that there's no difference between what the camera uses to focus and what you're seeing on the image itself. No more alignment issues. What you see is what you get. Now, even with all this smart tech, the autofocus system still only sees what's in front of it. It doesn't know, because it isn't you, it isn't in your brain, it doesn't know what you want in focus, and that's where AI and different focus modes starts to come into play. Now, your autofocus isn't binary. It isn't a yes or a no. You've got loads of options. You've got loads of ways of setting it up. You've got loads of ways of using it in the field. So instead of a binary process, think of your autofocus more like a toolbox. And if you're using a screwdriver to hammer a nail, of course, you're not going to have the most efficient process. That's why the first thing to get clear on is how your different focus modes behave. Now, if your subject is standing still, or it's a tree, or it's a building, someone posing for a portrait, for example, you want the camera to focus once and then hold that point steady. And that's where single shot autofocus comes in. But the moment anything starts moving, like a cyclist racing past or a kid running straight at you, which is probably the hardest thing for a camera to focus on, you then need to switch to continuous autofocus. This is going to keep tracking your subject constantly while they move, trying to adjust everything to make sure that the image is sharp. On all modern cameras, there's also a mode where the camera tries to switch between these two modes automatically, but in my experience, well, it never really works as well as just committing to one or the other. So unless you like your, what is a dumb camera, second guessing your very intelligent judgment, it's better just to commit to one of these autofocus modes and stick to it. But just choosing single autofocus or continuous autofocus isn't enough. You also got to obviously tell the camera where to look, and that's where different focus areas come in. So if you leave your camera on full auto, the camera's going to pick up on the closest thing with the highest contrast, and it's going to try and follow it. So that could be a tree trunk rather than the deer that's hiding behind the tree that you're trying to capture. It could be absolutely anything, because again, your camera is a tool. It doesn't understand the art, the image, the photograph that you're trying to create with it. Now, a better way to go about all this is probably to choose a single focus point and then place it over the part of the scene that you want sharp. Absolutely, for landscape photography, which is what I do a lot of, that is what I'm doing every single time. Now, sure, this is going to be slow, because you got to move the thumb stick around on the back of the camera, or you got to point on the back of the screen where you want focus, but it gives you full control and 100% accuracy. Alternatively, for fast action, like a dog playing fetch, or the classic difficult subject to capture, which is a bird in flight, then you need to lock focus onto the subject so that your camera can follow. To do this, you want to choose a larger autofocus point, or a Nikon. You've got 3D autofocus, and all these different camera manufacturers have different versions of this, but essentially you want to wider box and you want to put that over the subject as you track them using autofocus continuous. And then in more modern cameras, there is face detection, eye detection, pose detection, there is subject detections, all kinds of different detection modes that use, it's not really AI, it's machine learning, right? They call it AI, it's not really AI, but use machine learning or AI to understand what the subject is and then lock onto that specifically. And honestly, when this works, it feels like absolute magic. So for example, with eye detection, the camera is hunting for what it thinks is an eye. It will even on some cameras look for the eye that's closest to the camera so that you can get that tack sharp portrait shot every single time without fail. This is an absolute lifesaver for anyone doing portraits or still life or anything like that. Depending on your camera, how new it is, how fancy it is, it can also do this for animals, for sports. Specifically, I know Canon have settings now for basketball, for football, soccer if you're outside of the UK. And this can make photographing pets, wildlife, people so much easier. And one thing that we shouldn't overlook is manual focus. And surprisingly, this still has a place, especially if we're in a bit of a tricky situation where the camera is struggling. So a very low light situation, or if we're doing macro photography, for example. That's where you're going to flip to manual mode and you're going to take control of the situation. Now, many mirrorless cameras have a feature called focus peaking, which highlights the sharpest part of an image in real time. And this is absolutely what we want to have turned on for manual focus. And manual focus can take a little bit of practice, but once you get the hang of it, you're going to wonder why you faffed around in low light conditions previously with the autofocus that was just playing up, and you didn't just switch to manual focus and just do the damn job yourself. Now, tweaking your autofocus settings will absolutely depend on the camera that you have, the model that you have when you bought it, right? Nikons have fancy 3D tracking, Canons use dual pixel autofocus, which leads to different options in their menus. Sony have their own quirks as well. But here are a few things to consider across all of the modern mirrorless cameras that you're probably using right now if you're watching this video. So first off, make sure that your camera is set up to use all of the autofocus points that it has available to it, rather than just, for example, the center autofocus point. Next, enable low light autofocus mode if that's available. You could turn on the built-in autofocus illuminator light on the front of your camera, but every time I see one of those go off, I automatically think that person's an idiot. And if you're trying to do any wildlife photography, obviously that's going to startle whatever you're trying to take a picture of. So I don't do that, but if you're shooting in low light, that might help. Additionally, if you're struggling to lock onto your subject, you can increase the autofocus lock speed. Alternatively, if your camera locks onto your subject and then it loses it because it's trying to search for other subjects or it's trying to overcompensate for a lack of movement in your shot, then reduce this lock speed so it becomes a little bit more sticky. Now, if you're using contrast autofocus in your camera and there isn't much contrast in a scene, you can also try increasing the size of the focus box so that there's going to be more contrasty elements or more chance of a contrasty element within it. And there are also ways to make autofocus smarter without having to mess around with too many settings or even buy anything new. Back button autofocus is an absolutely prime example of this. So instead of using the shutter button to focus, you're going to assign a separate button, usually one on the back of the camera, to do the autofocus process. That way you decide exactly when you want autofocus because the shutter press and the autofocus have been put into now separate button presses. It takes a little bit of muscle memory to get used to, but almost every single high-level wildlife photographer I've ever engaged with, they all use back button focus. And so if that's what you're into, or you're doing sports photography or anything with fast-moving people or objects or subjects, it's probably worth considering. I've linked to a video where we cover back button focusing in more detail in the video description. And with that, why not click the video that's on the screen right now and continue improving your photography skills.